Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. I hope everyone's having a great holiday season as 2020 is finally wrapping up. And here on the channel, we're going to be celebrating this with the 12 Days of Christmas special featuring 12 separate top 5 lists related to the game Total War 3 Kingdoms. And today, we're going to take a look at the top 5 changes I want to see happening to the game. Now this one's going to be quite similar to the one yesterday where we talked about 5 brand new mechanics that I want to see added. This one's going to be a little different in that we'll talk about existing mechanics that I want to see just tweaked a little bit to improve or perhaps changed in a certain way to make it more interesting. So starting things off with number 1, we're going to talk about marriages. So currently the marriage system in the game functions 2 main purposes in my opinion. The first purpose is it gives you a suitable heir and also produces future suitable heirs as you can only have heirs from your family. And the second purpose is to steal legendary generals from other factions who might be single, or steal characters with good items from other factions who are single. And that requires that character to be part of the ruling family, as only ruling family members can marry. And then a very minor benefit you could kind of include is that if the characters are close family members, they get small defensive boost in battle. And should your family member die in the battle, whether they have resiliency or not, you will receive a small heal and a fallen family bonus after the fact. That's the current state of marriages. I think this can be improved a little bit. First off, we should introduce concubines to the game. This was a legitimate thing that existed back in the days, but limit concubines to non-ruling family members. So what I mean by this is status was still a real thing. So if my ruling family, let's say our main character's son or our main character himself, is proposing a marriage to another faction leader and their close family, that has to be a wife situation because both sides are faction leaders' families. Therefore, when you marry, you have to limit that to the highest status of marriage, the main wife. And then if you want to take in additional concubines, you can propose to other generals that are not part of the family. And that brings up to another point. You can have marriages between regular generals, and that can improve which generals you can steal from other factions, assuming they're single. The game does a pretty good job of getting characters married, so you're not going to find too many exploit here unless you just killed their husband or wife in battle. That is your golden opportunity. Now assume that happened during a war, or else how do you kill them? Or maybe you're looking at a war between 2 AI factions and it happens you see that character died. But in most cases, if you see them die, you propose peace the next turn, you throw the marriage as part of the peace deal. That's even realistic in my mind, because Cao Cao took many widows with that exact same technique. And if we see that in the game, that's great. They'll be added as concubines, they can have children with you, they will gain certain satisfaction boosts with the faction leader, but also lose certain satisfaction boosts with the main wife. And also because if you allow concubines, you have to lower the birth rate. Birth rate's a little bit too high in the game right now, because often by turn 90 to 100, you're going to have about 7 or 8 kids, and that's simply unrealistic with only one wife. Birth rate in China was not that high at the time. Or you can introduce child mortality if you want to keep birth rate high, because it's not like people didn't have as many kids, they just didn't survive to adulthood. In the game here, occasionally you will see some child mortality where they don't come of age and die beforehand, mainly for AI factions for some strange reason. But if you're going to introduce concubines, then lower the birth rate for everyone, therefore you don't have as many kids as you usually have. And since we're going to add the ability to marry officers, non-family member officers, it should add the ability for us to see the family trees. Right now we have this 关系 relationship branching network of a web that you see. Replace that with a family tree. You can still maintain friends webs from the top, maybe top half relationship, bottom half family tree, and that way you can keep track of which general has kids. they're not going to have a lot of kids because of the lower birth rate. And also for your minor characters who become concubines, it makes sense to see their other relationship, for example, her brothers or her parents, and they can become sort of close relatives with you. Therefore, you should be able to see their tree as well. So basically allow generals to have family trees and allow them to have kids. Because right now in the game, if you marry two of your generals who are not ruling family members, they will not have children. One of them must be a ruling family member from some ruling family. It doesn't have to be yours, but if both parents are not ruling family, then there will be no kids. Therefore, there's no point to give them a family tree. But here, I propose you allow the marriage between regular officers. You allow them to become concubines or main wives. It's not like they're exclusively concubines, but between two big factions, the marriages has to be a real wife marriage. And concubines can be exclusive to the regular officers. You can't have a concubine from another faction. You can only have a faction to faction marriage once. And therefore, for the general officers that are going to be introduced, they should have their separate family tree easy for you to view, rather than have this giant sprawling one in the family tab for all your generals. Then you also need to fix distant relatives. So these are all kind of related. Right now, the distant relative is a little bit crazy in the game, in that if you married with faction A, and faction A has more kids because of the higher birth rate, and they married one of their other kids to faction B, C, D, and E, all of a sudden you're close relatives with B, C, D, and E, and you can't propose any marriages between them. I don't think that's realistic. That's not how it worked. Only the kids who come from the marriage that was proposed between this shared faction A should be your close relatives, or distant relatives in this sense. Everyone else from the original faction B, C, D, and E shouldn't be your relative just because you guys share a marriage. It's very common for the two clans to have multiple marriages together through different generations, as long as they're not actually related. Look at Cao Cao and his father. They both took Lady Ding as wife, separate Lady Dings, probably an aunt and a niece, but that's not a close marriage because Cao Cao wasn't Lady Ding's son. So with concubines, you have to keep track of the family tree a bit more and fix the distant relatives that's currently in the game. Because right now, it's like you marry one faction, and if they freely marry their other kids to other factions, you can't find any marriages at all beyond that point. So these are some small tweaks I want to see changed to marriages, just to make things a bit different. Now, if you combine this with the mechanic we proposed last time about raising your kid, this could make the game a lot more fun and adds a totally different dimension to the gameplay, because now you're kind of managing your family as well, on top of the strategic elements of the grand strategy as well as the battle, and that can be something we hope to see in the future. Then moving on, the second thing I kind of want to tweak is espionage. Now, the current espionage system in the game I think is a lot better than it was on release. They added turncoats, they added some spy assignments, they added different spy actions, and with turncoats, things become a lot smoother, even though it kind of pushed out the original way you did spying, because it was just so inefficient compared to what you can do with turncoats. But I still think the system can be tweaked a bit more. And namely, if we look at what's available through literature, in terms of Romance of Three Kingdoms, of what happened, you can have some action for your current spies, whether they're a turncoat or not, to encourage that faction from recruiting a general that you're sending in as a spy. Because right now, one of the main purposes you want to do with espionage is to steal characters. So you need to do discredit character, you need to do discredit faction, and discredit faction requires a lot of spies in one faction to stack the -10 from that event to convince an otherwise very happy general to leave their faction. Therefore, you need a lot of spies. And you can't usually get that many turncoats from a faction, so you need to send your own spy in as well, but it takes forever for one to get picked up. So you have a new spy action for your turncoats who are already in the faction as vouch. All they need to do is spend a lot of their points to encourage their leader to recruit a said character because they vouched for them. Now, this can get a little bit complicated because let's say one of the characters become apparent that they're a spy. They get captured and executed. Does the character who vouched for them get executed too? It's likely. That would make a lot of sense, but that might be very hard to implement in the game. But I just think this will be a great way for a spy action to help push your regular spies from being able to be sent to a faction. Otherwise, they're just hanging out all the time, never getting recruited. The second spy action that I feel also reflects what we see in history and also what we see in literature is the ability to persuade. So right now there are two spy actions in interference and undercover network, I believe. I forgot what it's called, but it builds up your two spying points. You're trading your points to have the growth of another point so that you can perform an action. Well, let's have a third option where you spend both of your resources to increase diplomatic points. So right now we have improved relations. If you're a family member, that will boost your relationship by about 30 points. You should have one where you can have a non-family member or even a family member push for a spy action that gives you, let's say, 5 diplomatic points in the next deal you make with them. So it'll be a goodwill that you can use in a negotiation, a diplomatic negotiation later on. So you're persuading the other faction to accept whatever deal you're pushing for. And it doesn't have to be huge, but if you can spend various amount of your spy points to create those opportunities, you kind of mix the diplomatic elements of the game, which is really well made, and the espionage element, which is okay. It's not bad, but it can be better. And it can combine them to make them a more holistic thing. And that can add more flexible gameplay, whether you want to create a vassal, whether you want to trade for land, whether you want to ask them to declare war. That could all be options that you could have with this spy action. Then lastly, I think you can also make a tweak to your own court. Right now, I am extremely paranoid when I recruit new characters in court. If I see they don't have a grudge, if I see they don't want to spy for me, then I don't recruit them because I'm worried that they will be an AI spy. And there's not much I can do about it if they're an AI spy. Sure, I can push their satisfaction to 100 points and hope that they deflect. That's not always a guarantee. So maybe give us a court action. Right now we have banish, right now we have fire. Let's have one that's accuse, where we can approach a character and tell them, you're a spy. And if they are a spy, you should have the option to, say, send them back, convince them to stay, kind of like the post-battle capture screen, where you have options there. You can release them. They can gain fondness on you. You can send them back. You can kill them. So basically you have a choice there once you accuse. And if you accuse incorrectly, where they're not a spy, then you lose the character. So there's a risk there. But sometimes you have a character that's really good, that's in your pool, that you want to recruit, but you're pretty sure they're a spy. This will add a way for you to still get that character without worrying about the spy mechanic. Or you could do something like what you do right now. What you do right now is recruit the character, destroy their former faction, then they can't be a spy for them. But that's not always the best thing to do, especially if you get to the later stage of the game where the other faction is a giant kingdom or empire and you can't really just destroy them on command, or the fact that destroying them might be the end of the game. So here you can have something called accuse that can reveal the spy. If you're correct, you get rewarded. And if you're incorrect, obviously you get punished. And these can be small changes to the spy mechanic just to make things more fleshed out. Then on to number 3, we have military supplies. So right now, military supplies did get more interesting after a few patches. You have different uses for military supply depending on your subculture, where bandits have a completely different military supply system, which also ended up making military supplies really hard to change, because now the change has to apply to both of these subcultures, and it could get very difficult. So to make this discussion a little bit simpler, I'm going to ignore the bandit factor a little bit and just mainly focus on the Hun changes. I understand some of these changes will have repercussions for the bandits, but I can kind of explain them away. So the first major change we need to do is increase the embark cost. So when you send an army into a river or into an ocean, have the cost be military supplies. They have to pay military supplies and movement, which they do right now, and make that cost really, really high. Say 80 or higher. Maximum supplies is 100. So if you don't have the supplies, you can't even get into the water. And even if you have the supplies, you get into the water, you don't have much supply left. So you can't stay long in the river. You can't have resupplies in the river. You pretty much have your supplies, you get in the river, you start going. If you run out of supplies, you're going to suffer attrition. If you want to stay in the river, that is, or you can get on land and get supplies. And once you have enough resupply on land, you can hop back into the river if you want. This is a fair punishment, I feel like, for your armies. Now, for the AI, this could be really rough. AI might see that they have 80, they jump in the river and they start attritioning like crazy, and they still move like they usually do. Because we've seen AIs stay on march and never heal up and get destroyed. That's something you will see, especially if you have an AI faction who declare war on you from halfway across the map. They will spend all their energies reaching you, and by the time they get to you, they don't really have an army left. That's one problem we might experience here. But for players, this does rein in the player's ability to do things. And you might not like the AI consequences, but this is the best idea I have for controlling the river. Because in this case, if the AI can't even manage the supplies to be at 80, then they can't get in the river, which I feel like is fair. As for bandit factions, this might be a little rough because you want to keep your supply high, but sometime you might want to dump all that supplies because you get the loot mechanic, right? It's called loot for bandits factions. And if you dump the loot, you move farther. So perhaps embarking and disembarking can be a new mechanic where you can change your loot really, really quickly. And another thing I want to do with supplies is I want to use them to pay for siege equipment. We saw this in a video a couple days ago when I talked about the new units. Instead of having all your strategists carry the siege weapons as part of their retinue, they don't scale with unit size anyways, right? If you change from large to extreme, the number of siege weapons do not double. Don't make siege weapons a unit. Make siege weapons something you can trade with your supplies. So let's say I have 100 supplies. Make trebuchets cost 25 supplies each. Before battle, you can choose to spend your supplies to get siege weapons, and AIs can do this too. And after the battle, you run out of supplies. You can either siege the enemy supply, which now becomes more than the typical +8, because no one uses the siege supply option post-battle. The +8 is meaningless in the game, and that's an option that's just wasted. In this case, the winning army can get a huge resupply if they siege supplies, or else they have to kind of encamp and wait after battle to not only replenish their men that was lost, but also get supply back so they can bring siege weapons into the next fight. I feel like this is a good balance, and it also prevents you from sieging too much or using your trebuchets too much, because you have your trebuchets pretty much every battle. Open field battles forces enemies to walk into you. Now, you can strategically use them with the supply as a penalty. And you can still use them. You can use up to 4 of them per battle, but then you just have no supplies. And if you lose, it's extra punishing because you don't get the supplies back because you don't have the siege supply option. Now, of course, you win, and sometimes you might choose to get money, might choose to get replenishment. You might have to give up the supplies. But overall, this makes supplies much more relevant in the game, and you might actually pay attention to some of those supply increasing items or boosts from certain characters. Let's say Sima Yi and Zhuge Liang. I think both of them have a supply element, and high cunning characters give your army high supplies anyways, so those become all more relevant. And that can still maintain how good strategists are because of their skills and their retinues and such, and their high resupply. High cunning equals a lot of supplies for your army. So that can all play together, and you free them up from being the only units to get siege weapons by making siege weapons something you get in the army. Now, who's going to man those siege weapons? Force one of your infantry to do it, similar to how you force one of your infantry to push the ram or push the tower. Same idea. Just spare a unit to take care of however many trebuchets you spawn per battle. And that seems like a fair deal to me. So that's my proposed change for military supplies. And moving on, for the fourth change, we have character spawning events. So these are characters that spawn into the game through events. Say Zhuge Liang on turn 83 and Sima Yi around turn 90. Now those are not exact turns, they're usually a range. So for example, Zhao Yun's spawn chance is between like turn 8 and turn 20 for Liu Bei's faction, like after a battle. They'll check for the spawn chance. And Zhuge Liang's between turn 83 and turn 100, where you can get the event chain to start, and then you can recruit him. Da Qiao, Xiao Qiao works this way, Pang Tong works this way, Xu Shu works this way. There are so many legendary characters who work this way. And there's some issues with the current implementation of this. One, obviously, everyone feels like the chance is a bit low. It's actually not that low. For a lot of campaigns, the chance is pretty fair. I think it's way more than 50%, but the problem is if you miss out on one, you feel really bad because you're hoping to collect all of them. I think most players in the game, there are only two types of legendary characters, the ones that you have and the ones that you don't have. And no one likes the ones that you don't have. So they wish for these events to be almost 100%. That might be too much in my opinion. I think still a sandbox game, you shouldn't have 100% on any of these chances, but what you need to do is have random spawns after they time out. So for example, let's say Sima Yi spawns from 90 to 100 in Cao Cao's faction, set amount of chance, let's say 75% chance each turn it checks, and you get extremely unlucky and you don't get him. Well, don't make the character disappear from the game. Give him out into a random recruitment pool after the event has timed out, so that he still spawns into the game. It's just an alternative universe where he's in some other faction because he never joins Cao Cao because you're unlucky. And for AI factions, if you're not playing them, use the random spawns to introduce the character in the game. I don't think characters should not be allowed to spawn into the game if they're not being played as the main faction. So I think this is the key change. Always have the characters in the game and add more fondness to some of these historical characters so that you can see them join the right factions, or if you're playing that faction hoping to get them and you missed out on the event, and even if they went to a random faction after you destroy that faction or after someone else destroyed that faction, or if they leave dissatisfied, they have a chance to return to you because they have historical fondness on themselves. I think all these are good changes to help players enjoy the character a bit more, and I think they're not that hard to implement here. Then lastly, we'll talk about victory conditions. So right now in the game, there are generally one victory condition where you get 3 Emperor seats and you get 95 counties. I know this is a little different for the Naman factions and for the Mandate War factions, which can still continue to achieve this victory condition if you want, but you just don't get any special reward for it. This is the typical one, and we're going to call it the Emperor Seat Victory. And it makes sense for 3 kingdoms. You get 3 Emperor seats, you win the game, whether you're a governor, whether you are a warlord, or a bandit. But my problem with this is it's too plain and kind of dull once you do this a lot of time. And for some factions, this doesn't make any sense. Because you should have governors do a restoration victory, for example, where you have to perhaps save the emperor, reset the capital in Luoyang, and have a certain amount of land for however many turns, or rebuild the palace building in Luoyang as one of your victory conditions, and then you get a cutscene as a governor. That's better than you going out there and conquer the 3 emperor seat and then eventually become an emperor yourself. That's not really a governor playstyle. And then you can also have horde victories. Now this introduces horde mechanics, which I hope to see one day in 3 Kingdoms, because if they're going to add nomad factions in the north or other subcultures, their victory condition can't be become one of the 3 Kingdoms. Like what they did with the Nama factions, they did it fairly well, where your goal was never to make a 3 Kingdoms. Your goal is to your goal for the Naman faction might be to create a Naman kingdom. Your goal for a Nomad faction might be to loot wealth, burn down cities, kill X amount of troops, gather X amount of wealth, have a really bad economy that can only grow if you're constantly fighting as a horde army, and you can't maintain any settlements, you can only raise them. And when you reach a certain amount of wealth and raise a certain number of land, including, let's say, a capital, that's your victory condition. That would be a lot more interesting to play than, say, you end up playing a Xiongnu faction and your goal at the end is get 95 counties on the map. That makes no sense to me, and I hope they don't go that route. So I hope they add just more victory conditions into the game as a whole, just to spice things up, and also change it for some of the bandits faction perhaps. Bandits don't need 95 counties and 3 emperor seats for a victory. That does not make too much sense. I think it's just a lot better to give them some other goals to work towards, whether it's wealth, whether it's set amount of land raised, or certain settlements that they need to capture, but just something that varies their victory conditions away from what you typically associate with one of the 3 Kingdom warlords. And with that, that's all the 5 changes I want to see. Tomorrow we're going to go do something very different. We'll talk about 5 exploits in the game that I want to fix. It should be a fun one. There are a lot of really interesting exploits in the game right now that you can cheese the AI, if you want to use that term. But they add certain gameplay elements. I'm going to pick the 5 that I actually want change. There are some cheese I think would be pretty good if they stay in the game. So we'll get to that next time. Until then, bye.